set up the back end of everything. And the second talk is going to write the front end. And the second talk is in room number 1, I believe. So both parts are important, of course. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is to figure out the challenges of authentication. How exactly do you build the backend? So first I will talk a little bit architecture, and then I'll walk you through the code. And hopefully by the end of this talk, we will have a fully functional backend ready supporting OAuth authentication. Of course, the app needs to do something. So what the something that I will do in this is that I will basically connect to an Office 365 site, and I'll show the title of that site in an authenticated manner. Of course, you can make it talk to a database or anything else you want. So let's get rolling. So again, before I waste your time, this talk is 100% developer-centric. So if you don't write code, you might still find it interesting, but as a developer, I think you'll find it more interesting. The concepts involved are the following. It's okay to not know some of these. It's hard to find anybody who knows all of these. And as I said, there are 2 parts. First, where I'll build the backend, and the second part where I'll build the actual app. Since the talk is just 30 minutes, it'll look like I'm going through it at lightning speed. But the aim of this is to show you the concepts, get you inspired, and hopefully you can go home and build this on your own. I'll give you plenty of links so you can basically follow it along. So let's start. As I said, lightning fast, and I'm going to go through slides a little bit quickly. The conventional Microsoft developer is dead. Why? Because even Microsoft is focusing on different technologies. They're being open source. When you talk about mobile applications, there are some main challenges to solve. Number 1, what platform do you pick? Number 2, how is your mobile app going to talk to your data, the servers that you may have on premises? Number 3, the security. And again, security for enterprise apps is completely different for security for open app store apps that you might download and use. When you talk about security, and this is a topic that we can talk about for 5 days, but long story short, these days everybody's using token-based authentication, and there are very good reasons why they're doing that. And the number 1 most common token-based authentication is OAuth, right? Many ways to do OAuth, but that for native apps, that's what you almost have to do these days. It's very, very important that that's what we'll use. A lot of major companies are pushing what they call as embedded web views. Like if you have Skype on iPhone and you sign in using a Microsoft account, it transitions to a web page and you provide your Microsoft account over there. That is generally a bad idea because that means anybody can host that web page. And I don't know about your mom, but my mom always checks for HTTPS certs before she provides her passwords, right? So, but the thing is, when you start embedding these web views inside of an app, then you don't even see a place to see the SSL cert validity or not. And there are these devices like Pineapple, etc., where I can set up a simple, a stronger Wi-Fi network that says Telenor on it, hack your DNS, and point you to my server that renders a page exactly like Microsoft's login account, right? Embedded web views is a bad idea. Right? So you should never use that in mobile apps. Unfortunately, a lot of apps out there are using it. Some common mistakes, a lot of people, especially in the enterprise space, are trying to solve mobile apps with the same hammer that they use for Windows laptops. That again is a bad idea. You cannot add an iPhone to your domain. Direct access doesn't work on anywhere except Windows for Enterprise. So there are different set of technologies, different challenges you have to use. End-to-end encryption, everything HTTPS. That goes without saying. And then for enterprise scenarios, you may need to worry about other situations as well, as in if my app is on your personal device and you lose your device, I still need to be able to secure my data. Connectivity is also an interesting challenge. When I have an app in the open app store talking to Facebook, that's easy because there's a direct HTTP connectivity. But when you need to talk across firewalls, then you have a whole bunch of challenges. Maybe you can use a VPN or similar technology. You can use bidirectional TCP communication, relay, or there is something called as Azure remote endpoints. You can set up a web service inside your network, expose it outside using Azure AD, and that's another way that you can bridge that connectivity. As you can see, there's a lot of detail behind here, so I can't discuss everything. But these are just ticklers into the things that you might want to consider. The next question is, what platform do we pick? HTML5, maximum reach. It's just a website. But browsers on mobile phones are usually a lot more up to date on phones than they are on our desktops. So maximum reach, but anytime you want to tap into native capabilities, you have most native capabilities in HTML5, but they are inferior compared to actual native app. What do I mean by native capabilities? Taking pictures, taking videos, accelerometer, GPS, etc. I can find your location using purely HTML5, but it's not going to be as accurate as a native app will be. And offline experience is very, very hard to get right on native apps, especially if you want encrypted offline experience, forget about it. JavaScript cannot do encryption. Well, it can, but you can't keep it secret. Then the other choice is hybrid. Hybrid is like Cordova or Icenium or any of these platforms where you have a native shell, but your user interface and some of your logic might be JavaScript or HTML5. That's a pretty good choice. In that you sort of get best of both worlds, but in my experience it takes a lot of experience and practice to do this 100% right. So basically the app needs to feel native and act native and so on and so forth. The important change that has happened with iOS 8 is that before iOS 8, the JavaScript engine hosted in a web view used to be throttled down to 1/7 the speed. That is no longer the case on iOS 8. So your app running in Safari is going to be just as responsive as Safari hosted inside of an app. So this is a very, very viable platform. And actually, there are a lot of apps out there right now that are built using hybrid. Like you might have heard of this game called Temple Run, right? That is a hybrid app, believe it or not, right? So if somebody could write a game in that, certainly we can write business apps using that. But it still needs you to learn the local platform, right? Java, Swift, Objective-C, C#, whatever the underlying platform is, you still need to learn them. Then there is another platform getting a lot of traction called Xamarin. Xamarin is one of those platforms that I'm incredibly impressed by as far as its technical capabilities go. But in real world, when I actually start writing apps, I question the value of it because an app simply is screens and storage. Everything else is in a backend WCF service or REST API or MVC or Node.js or something like that, right? So if I have any reusable logic that is not UI, then Xamarin is a good idea. But you may say, well, they just released UI. They have Xamarin Forms. But when I'm writing UI, I want the UI to be native to the device that I'm targeting. I don't want iOS UI on Windows Phone and vice versa, right? So if I'm writing a native app or a hybrid app, I care about those native capabilities. So Xamarin is not a good fit there, not to mention their V1 release on UI is very, very slim at this point. So it really comes down to like if I'm writing a big calculation engine or something like that, and yes, over there I can use PCLs, but then even if I go with PCLs, there's a very small subset of .NET that I can actually use in Xamarin, right? So there are some challenges over there, but as a consultant, and if there's a need for Xamarin, of course, Xamarin is a good choice. And then finally, you have native, where you put in 3x the effort for 3 platforms, but the end result is very good, but you have 3 different code bases. So there's this new language that Apple introduced called Swift. If you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to do so. For everybody who hates Objective-C, I think you'll find Swift a lot more usable, right? It feels like C# with a little bit of Objective-C poison in it. So it's got that little bit of that personality because they can't break away from it. The cool thing is that in one single project, Xcode project, you can have both Swift and Objective-C side by side, right? So basically you can work with Objective-C in the same platform. A little bit, who am I? A lot of you may know me from a SharePoint Office 365 sort of a background. I've been an MVP for 12 years, authored 16 books, and so on and so forth. So you can Google about me. I'll skip over that. So there have been a lot of interesting speakers over here. Like Douglas Crockford was here. His claim to fame is that he invented JSON. My claim to fame is that last year when I was at TDC, I took this picture in the bathroom right there. It was basically this Dyson urinal. This is a picture of it's a hand dryer. So basically I tweeted that this strange looking urinal blew my pee all over the place. And believe it or not, people are still retweeting that 1 year after. So this original picture was taken by me at TDC. So it's a part of internet history now. So let's talk about some architecture. Now, you could write an app. Now I'm targeting Office 365. So Microsoft has released an SDK for Azure AD at this time. We are hoping that maybe tomorrow they will release an SDK for Office 365. Of course, I don't have any knowledge of that. But let's say they come out with an SDK. The problem is, then you're writing an app that is hard tied to Office 365. Typically, the apps that you write these days, they may be talking to multiple backends. Or you want to have the flexibility of changing that backend anytime you wish without having to update the app on everybody's phones. Because remember, things that are deployed on people's phones you're going to have a hard time to update. You don't control those updates. So, and rolling out an app is a lot different than rolling out regular software, even in our company. We have no control on when that app will get updated. So when we're on version 5, we need to support version 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and updates from each version to each version. That can be a very difficult challenge. So instead of creating an architecture like that, I decided to go with an architecture like this. The reason for this is now I'm no longer tied into Azure AD only, right? I can use standards-based communication, and I can have my username password store if I wanted to. I can switch it out at any point. I can update logic on the ASP.NET backend whenever I want it without having to go through an approval process in the App Store and so on and so forth. And if I accidentally rolled out a security issue, there's a good chance that I can fix that in the backend without having to touch everybody's apps, right? So this is the architecture that I decided to go with. So let's start looking at some code. Again, I got 20 minutes left. So what I did, create a mobile backend, which is an ASP.NET MVC web API site that supports OAuth for authentication and cores. Why did I go with cores? Because the app I'm going to write is not going to run in the same domain as my services, right? The HTMLs or the front end or whatever I have for the app is going to be local, native. So I cannot download it within the same website. I have to be able to make a cross-domain request, right? And the advantage of that, obviously, is that once I'm making a cross-domain request, then the cookies, etc., are being used purely for storage, not for authentication, right? And there are lots of advantages of that architecture. One advantage, obviously, is that if everything can be stored locally, nothing is being downloaded, so the user interface will feel a lot more responsive. Anytime you've used like a HTML site and say, it just doesn't feel right. Like I tap on it and there's a little delay because it's going to the server, it is downloading things. We don't have to do that anymore, right? Everything is local, it loads instantly. We're going to the server only for data. Step 1, I created an ASP.NET MVC project. Step 2, I added a couple of NuGet packages. Step 3, I'm using Owen, so it's an attribute. I'm pointing it to a startup.cs, so I went ahead and added a startup.cs, and I got rid of the global.asax, because all my startup code is in the startup.cs file. Step 3, in web API config, I started adding some roots, as you can see over there. So, zoom in a little. So you see over there these roots, that's what I'm talking about. So basically in the startup, this web API config.cs, I went ahead and added some roots. Now the next thing I need to do is have my basic project structure ready. The next thing I need to do, I need to set up authentication. Now you can use authentication back to anything, your Active Directory, existing database or whatever, but I went ahead and used Entity Framework to give me the simple ASP.NET DB database so I can have a username password, simple as that. So step 1, I went ahead and added a couple of NuGet packages, so I have Entity Framework support. I added an auth context that inherits from identity DB context, and I added this connection string that you see at the bottom of the page. Now what that connection string lets me do is that when I hit F5 on my Visual Studio project, when I run it, it'll connect to that database, it'll go ahead and create that database for me, right? Code first. Then I create a model to represent the user. To keep things simple, I have only a username and password. On password, I put some basic validation that the password must be a certain number of characters long, etc. You can enhance this, first name, last name, city, repeat password, whatever, right? So far, what you're looking at, if you've worked with ASP.NET MVC, this is very, very straightforward. How many of us here have never worked on ASP.NET MVC? So hardly anyone. So anybody who has worked on ASP.NET MVC, you're looking at this going, yeah, nothing new so far, right? This is very, very straightforward. So let's continue. Then I added a class called auth repository. And what am I doing in this auth repository? I have two methods, register user and find user. Register user is going to insert a record into the database to create a new user, and find user is going to accept a username password. You can guess what it'll be used for. Like when I log in, it is going to validate my username and password. So I've created such a backend class. Then I add a controller, and you can ignore everything else, but the only thing we need to care about is the register method. And in the register method, I have allow anonymous. So you don't need to sign in to register. That makes sense, right? But basically what I've done over here, so this is an API controller. I'm using Web API. So now what I should be able to do is that I should be able to issue a post request, right? Where I can pass in this user model. And with that post request, I should be able to create a new user, right? At this point, I should be able to do that. Remember, there is no authentication in the system yet, but for me to try out authentication, I need a test user. So let's go ahead and set up a test user. So what I did over here is that basically I'm using something called as Postman, and I've already set up everything over here on a port 81 on my local server. So I'm going to go ahead and open Chrome, and Chrome has got an app called Postman. And what Postman lets me do is that it lets me, well, that's terrible. Okay, let's do that. So Postman, what Postman lets me do is that it'll let me, create a new user account. So let me go ahead. I already have this user account, so I'm going to add a 1 over there. But what it will do, let me also open SQL Server Management Studio so I can show you what's in the backend database. Connect. And okay. And select star from ASP.NET user, users, F5. So you see I've got only one row in there. It's a little too small to read, I understand. But it's one row with a hashed password. The theory is that if I was to execute this post request from here, which I'm doing right now, the first time it's slow, it's warming up, etc. But at the end of this, I should be able to see a second row created over there, right? So I've created a test user, right? Let's come back to slides. So I've created a test user. Now, I have my basic authentication setup. Let's talk a little bit about business logic. I want my business logic to be protected by authentication, right? And the business logic over here is basically that it's supposed to just return a string, which is going to be the title of my Office 365 site. Now here, you could have connected to a database, you could have connected to a web service, whatever you prefer, right? But I'm going to connect to an Office 365 site. But notice at the very top, I have the authorize tag, which means I need to be authenticated before I can make that call. Now, if I try to access that route right now, right? If I went to /API/SPWeb and I did not provide any authentication information, I would get a 401 unauthorized because I have an authorized attribute at the very top. So let's add some authentication. How did I add support for OAuth? With NuGet, it's just so easy. I add a NuGet package, and I add a class called username password authorization provider, in which I write my logic. And remember that auth repository class I wrote a while ago that had a register user method and a find user method? So I'm basically just calling the find user method over here, and I am validating the user. And if I find a user, yes, otherwise no. And I also have the ability to add claims at this point. Because what gets issued back here is a JWT token, or they call it a JAR token. And a JAR token is an OAuth token, which has got a number of things in it. It's got the issuer. It's got not before, valid not before a certain time. And it's got not valid after a certain time, expires. And it's got claims. And you can choose to add more information in there as well, authorization, etc. Writing JAR tokens, validating JAR tokens, encrypting JAR tokens is a whole other topic in itself. So we'll leave that for another day. But at the end of the day, this JAR token for OAuth is called as an access token. OAuth has got two kinds of tokens, access tokens and refresh tokens. And an access token is something that I get, once I get the token, then any request I wish to make, I would pass that access token in an authorization HTTP header. And if the token is still valid, my request will be succeeded, right? So an access token, generally speaking, is valid for a short time. 30 minutes is typical, right? When you write your application, you control how long it will be valid for. But sometimes what happens is, so you don't have to sign in before every request you do. So we give you an access token that is valid for 30 minutes. Now, if somebody stole your access token, then they can party as you. So you need to keep this access token secure. So everything is HTTPS. By definition, if you're using OAuth, everything needs to be HTTPS. But if your access token expires, how do you get a new access token? To get a new access token, you use a different kind of token called as the refresh token. And the refresh token is longer in duration. It is stored on the server and on the client hopefully encrypted. And it is stored in some sort of persistent storage. And the purpose of refresh token is that when my access token expires, use the refresh token to get a new access token. And the advantage of this is that you don't have to keep signing in. You don't have to keep providing your credentials. Once you've granted access, it is valid for the duration of the refresh token, right? And refresh tokens are good for 6 months or a year, or you can decide whatever that is. But the biggest advantage of a refresh token is that if that device gets compromised, you can invalidate the refresh token on the server, right? So it supports revocation, right? So these are basic OAuth concepts. To keep things simple, I did not implement a refresh token, right? So let's continue. So then to finish OAuth, basically in the startup.cs in the configuration method, I had to add OAuth authorization server options. And as you can see, for test purposes, I said it's okay to use HTTP, just for test purposes. And also I basically said that the token endpoint path is /token. So all my authentication requests will go to my URL /token. And then in startup.cs, the last thing I did is that I added support for CORS, and that's the easiest thing to do. Add another NuGet package, add a line, and you have CORS support. And at this point, my basic project is done. It should support authentication. The only other thing I need to do is I need to add the actual logic. Because remember the controller that I added a while ago. Let's see if I can find it. Controller. Did I jump over it? Right, I think I jumped over it. The controller that I added a while ago, I brought this one here. So here I'm just returning a hard-coded string. Now I want to be able to add logic so it actually does something. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to turn this into, you can test it out with the username password, but then you basically add your logic inside of it. So I turned it into a SharePoint app. You need to register that app inside of Office 365. We'll leave that for another day. But there's a process you go through. And then basically I've added some code over here, actual code over here, to get me the title of my Office 365 site. If any of us are interested in SharePoint or Office 365, that you've written code for this, you would find this code instantly recognizable. But remember, the idea of it is maybe you could be talking to a database or something like that. So I won't dive too much deeper into this. At this point, I should be able to test my API. So let's try it. So I'm going to go back into my virtual machine here. Again, I'll open Postman. Step 1, I wish to be able to authenticate. So I'm going to go ahead and authenticate at /token. I have to pass in these headers, and I have to pass in grant type password. If I was using a refresh token, I would say grant type refresh token. And instead of passing in a username password, I would pass in the refresh token. But what happens here is that if this username password is valid, I can run this and it returns me an access token, right? This is a simple JAR token, though it is encrypted with the machine key. That's what ASP.NET does. So anyway, and it sees that I have set the expiration to a very long time. Typically speaking, access tokens, you don't want to keep them valid for that long. But because I didn't have refresh tokens, I had them run for a very long time. So I'm going to take this access token, okay, and I'm going to put this in, let's say, Notepad. And now with this access token, I can make authenticated calls into my API. So I can go back here, I can go into this SPWeb title, and first I will make a call without the access token. The access token goes here. Now before I actually make the call, let's go ahead and log into my Office 365 site and see what that looks like. Just give it a second. So how many of us here have used SharePoint in any way, shape, or form? So you've seen a lot of progress bars, right? So it's like the most boring part. You sign in, and then you have to wait, see these progress bars. Of course, providing the right password would be helpful. So this is my dev site. And let's go ahead and sign in. Yeah, that's SharePoint. I can't do much about that. This progress bar spinning. It's very hard to do, like good presentations on SharePoint because there's just so much empty space to fill. But okay, here we go. So the title of my site is TDC Rocks, of course. So let's go back here and see I have the app installed over here and all that. Let's go back here into my mobile site. First, I'll make an unauthenticated call. Oh, okay, sorry. I have to point it to the right URL, of course. That would help. And it says authorization has been denied for the request because guess what? I didn't provide an auth token, right? So now I'm going to take this access token, and in the authorization header, I'll say bearer, and I'll paste that access token in front. I'm going to hit send. Bam. My API is fully functional now. Okay? So I have like 4 minutes left, after which I'm going to go to the next room where I will write the front end for this. But just think about the coolness of this. Now what this allows me to do is that it allows me to write plain HTML, plain JavaScript, or any front end, a Windows 8 app, a native app, in any platform. As long as I can make HTTP requests in a cross-domain fashion, I should be able to write a front end now that allows me to use whatever services I offer back here. Right now it's just showing title, but I can make it more attractive. So in the next talk, which is in the room over there, which I'm going to pack up and run, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to write a single page application, SPA, using AngularJS, targeting the same backend, right? And then I will package up that SPA into a Cordova app. I'll add support for iOS, and then we'll run it and debug it in Xcode, and you'll be able to see like debugging in Xcode and Visual Studio in parallel, and let's see how that looks like. Cool? Love to take any questions. I'm going to start packing up. Thank you.